common, I'd agree with that, but abnormal, I'm not actually so sure. And we're going to kind of get on to why as we work through this today. Now, an important thing to kind of pick up about psychosis is this is not traditionally a diagnosis. One cannot be diagnosed with it in the same way that you could be diagnosed with measles or autism or schizophrenia or any of the rest of it. It's a description of a state of mind, a description of a particular set of experiences and behaviours. Obviously, those descriptions have emerged from psychiatry, so it kind of feels the same as that other stuff. But you can't really be diagnosed with psychosis. There's been this bit of a change recently, partly because there's been a move away from diagnosing people with schizophrenia, because that term is very stigmatised and tied up in all sorts of unhelpful stuff. And now sometimes services do talk about someone having psychosis and being treated for it. But traditionally, in terms of psychiatry, you can't be diagnosed with it. What it is instead is this thing that's associated with other stuff. So there are various mental illness diagnoses that are closely associated with psychosis. Schizophrenia is the kind of prototypical one, but there are many others, and I set you some homework to kind of find some of these out. But it's also associated with lots of physical illnesses, so particularly people who are very ill with particular kinds of conditions can have these experiences or exhibit these kinds of behaviours. And then I think another important thing to think about is this can be kind of induced in the absence of any of this, so without any of this stuff being present. So sleep deprivation, dehydration, combination of sleep deprivation, dehydration and a bit of drugs sometimes takes people into this state. And these are people who have not necessarily had histories of mental health problems, and they're people who are maybe okay again afterwards. What I'm getting at, I think, is that perhaps what we're talking about when we talk about psychosis is a kind of extreme psychological response to extreme stuff. This is really reflected by the fact it can be recurring or transient. So, as I've just said, there are some people who can have one episode of this. The majority of people, actually, who have an episode of psychosis have just one. And they were okay before, and they were okay afterwards. I know a couple of people from kind of my formative years who I went to school with who had episodes of psychosis, and for one of those people it was a one-off thing. She overdid the drugs, and can I just say that most people who use drugs don't have issues with psychosis. I don't think I'm saying anything so crude, but she really overdid it. Yeah, some people get really into it. She got really into it. She didn't go to bed for a while, a few weeks, and it kind of took her over the edge, and she did end up in hospital. Then I've got someone else I know from my kind of early years who had a similar experience in similar circumstances, but for him, then this became something very recurrent, actually, and it's something that he has never really shifted out of. So in fact, for some people, they kind of seem to, this becomes a kind of a chronic state. They'll have some times where it is much more acute than others, but it's kind of always there. Same sort of sets of experiences, but for some people, they're a lot, and for other people, they're maybe just once. So what might that be about? Well, actually, it kind of all links to the stuff from last week, interestingly. For those people for whom it is recurrent or chronic, very often are people with a history of trauma or abuse or adversive stuff, problematic family dynamics, stressful lives. It's interesting that people with stressful lives or for whom horrible things have happened tend to be those people who, if they have an episode like this, it kind of doesn't shift in the same way that it does for people who haven't had those experiences. Which might even suggest that perhaps some of the things we're going to talk to you about today actually kind of have a function. Maybe some of these unusual behaviours do something that are kind of protective in some ways. I want you to hold on to that thought, because I think it's important as we go through this. Have you had to turn the computer off?
No, it's just a monitor.
Right. Can I turn it back on? Is that alright?
It's not off, it's disconnected.
Oh, right, okay.
I was trying to get it to just project onto
Yeah.
It
Is that not
appear
happening?
to be a false. So
Right,
it's not
okay.
any of the obvious things that we usually do. So.
Okay, could I borrow someone's handout? I'm sorry about that. Cheers, thank you very much. So we're not going to see the videos. You're basically going to have to tolerate me just talking about this with no slides. Because that's what people have described in the past. You know, psychiatrists have written about this stuff and they've said, well, this is what psychosis is, and that kind of makes it what it is. So they don't necessarily all fit together particularly well. And what's interesting is you don't have to exhibit or experience these three things all at the same time to be said to have issues with psychosis. You kind of just need one of them, and this thing that unites all of them. So, the three things are hallucinations, delusions, something called thought disorder. So you have to have at least one of those things going on for people to talk about you in terms of psychosis, but you also have to have something else really crucial. You have to have some kind of loss of insight about the nature of these experiences. Because as we'll get into, all of this stuff shades actually into normal experience. The difference for the person who gets called psychotic as opposed to not seems to be much more about them losing insight, losing somewhat a contact with reality, not necessarily an entirety. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, that's fine. Don't worry. Thanks for your help. Yeah. Okay. No, don't worry. So the important thing is this loss of insight, the loss of kind of knowledge about what these experiences mean. So, let's start with hallucinations, because as we talk through what those are, you'll kind of get that. You'll understand why there could be an issue of a kind of loss of insight. So, we're now to the slide that says hallucinations 1 at the top. I'm just going to screen off because it's just insulting me. Go away. Shut down. Right, hallucinations. So what is a hallucination? A hallucination is some kind of perception in the absence of any stimulus. So in other words, making sense of something in a sensory stream, but the sensory stream actually isn't there. Now, this is something that all of us experience all the time. Every single person in this room will have experienced some kind of hallucination. Now, here's a kind of dramatic example. When you're falling asleep or just waking up, all kinds of really weird stuff can happen, and you can kind of sometimes, not necessarily everyone in the room, but some people here may have had those experiences where you kind of think someone's in the room or something's going on, or you're kind of experiencing something as actually happening and you're not quite asleep, you're not quite awake. I mean, that's definitely sort of a hallucinatory state. But then you kind of come out of it and you know what's going on, so you feel alright usually, even if it's quite a scary experience. But then there's just little things. So like, everyone sometimes thinks that like, the phone goes off when it doesn't, or maybe even you think you kind of hear someone call your name and you look around and there's no one there. These are things that might not happen very much, but they happen to all of us all the time. So hallucinations are not unusual. They are something that is totally part of everyday human experience. Things that can kind of affect all the senses, so like things you see and hear, but like taste, smells, these are all things that one can hallucinate. Like many drugs have like not recreational, well maybe actually recreational and prescribed drugs do all sorts of funny things to your taste. So like if you're tasting a bit funny, then that is a hallucination. And we talk about hallucinations in terms of being simple or complex, and simple ones are simply just kind of an experience of, I don't know, a bit of a blue light over here, or a bit of a beep noise over there. They're things that don't really have a meaning in themselves. They're just a simple sensory phenomena, but the sensory stuff isn't actually there. We're still perceiving them, but they don't kind of make any sense. Complex hallucinations, however, are things that make sense. So they might be hearing noises that sound not just like a beep, but actually like something. All of the examples I gave you, like your phone going off in your pocket, that is a complex hallucination because it is a meaningful thing. You think like the phone's gone off and it hasn't, so we'd call that complex. Whereas, I don't know, if it was just like, you just kind of felt something in part of your body, I guess pins and needles is an example actually of a simple hallucination because like, there's nothing there, but you're sensing something, and you know that it's not kind of a meaningful thing. So that's like a distinction, simple and complex. And some hallucinations can be really complex, and they can be about actually kind of seeing fully formed beings walking around. I mean, this is rare. Most people don't hallucinate to that extent, unless they've kind of taken hallucinogenic drugs, in which case they do that quite a lot. But complex hallucinations are quite central to psychosis, actually. So when we're thinking about hallucinations and psychosis, we are thinking of complex ones. Sorry, this is a bit sketchy, so it's really hard doing that. Okay. In psychosis, complex auditory hallucinations are kind of the most common thing. So what we're really talking about here is hearing voices, which everyone kind of will be familiar with this idea of maybe people with sometimes mental health difficulties hearing voices. Okay, so voices saying words that have meaning. They might not be saying scary things or horrible things. Perhaps for a minority of people, they do have voices saying commanding or frightening things. But most people actually don't have those experiences if we're talking about hearing voices. And another very important thing is the vast majority of people who hear voices are not psychotic. Many people hear voices. They describe the experience, at least, of hearing voices, but we would not talk about them as having psychosis. Why is that? Well, it's all about the insight. For the majority of people who have these very complex auditory hallucinations, and maybe people in the room in front of me now who have these experiences, the key point is most people are aware that they're hallucinations. So even if they are hearing a voice or having that experience of hearing a voice, they don't think that that voice is coming from outside of them, or that someone will put the voice in their head. They're very aware that it is just a hallucination. Where things tip across into what would be described as psychosis is where that insight starts to unravel. And it could be just a little bit of unravelling, where the person begins to think elements of what they're hearing, and begins to question, are these things hallucinations or are they not? Or maybe kind of full on, having these experiences and believing quite wholeheartedly that they are not hallucinations, that they are real voices. So, I'm trying to position this, I guess, in terms of behaviours, experiences that you'd all be familiar with. But what we're talking about is when those everyday experiences perhaps ramp up a bit, and then when there is a kind of lack of insight about their meaning. Let's move on to the next slide. Hallucination, part 2. Now, there's been loads and loads of research on hallucinations. I really don't want to go into all that kind of brain research today, because I think it's an incredibly unhelpful way of understanding psychosis, actually. It's a set of experiences. But here's one finding that's kind of interesting. People have done that EEG thing, where they put those nets on your head that measure electrical activity in your brain, and they kind of see which bits of your brain seems to be doing what. And the frequently cited finding is that people who experience auditory hallucinations of a complex nature, particularly hearing voices, be they people with psychosis or not, demonstrate activity in the bits of the brain you would expect if they were actually hearing things. So in other words, the auditory bits of the brain, the speech comprehension bits, appear to be active, not overly active, in people who have or experience auditory hallucinations. I think we need to be really careful with that, because it would be very easy for me to then say, oh, well, auditory hallucinations are therefore caused by overactivity. Well, we can't say that, can we? Actually, all we know is that people have those experiences, have activity sometimes in those bits of the brain, and not all of them do anyway. So we don't know which way around that is. I mean, perhaps if you have the experience of hallucinations, those bits of your brain light up, rather than those bits of the brain causing experience of hallucinations, if you see what I mean. And also, another important thing here is you cannot make assumptions about what someone is really experiencing. So many people, of course, will say that they hear voices, but what does that actually mean? I'm not saying that people lie, but there is probably a spectrum between people who really truly experience hearing voices over here, and then at the other hand, people who say they experience hearing voices, and they may well experience all sorts of things, perhaps including troubling or unpleasant, intrusive thoughts, so they kind of think about stuff they don't want to think about, and I think perhaps some people like that may rationalise really unpleasant, intrusive thoughts that pop into their head that they don't want to think about by thinking about them in terms of hearing voices, if that makes sense, because it's just an experience, isn't it? So we don't actually know. There's this group of people who say, well, yes, I hear voices. Who knows what their individual experiences are? And we need to be careful of lumping this group together, because I don't think they are all one and the same. All we know is they all say the same thing, which is, I experience hearing voices. But regardless of all of that, very important, for everybody who hears voices, or experiences these kind of complex hallucinations with or without a lot of insight, when you actually look at what they say they hear, there's quite clearly always some kind of personal significance. So it's not like you just randomly hear something that means absolutely nothing to you whatsoever. It doesn't seem to work that way. It seems instead that these experiences have a very clear personal significance for the people who have them. So what might that be about? I think we'll pick that up later, but hold on to that. Very easy to depersonalise this stuff in terms of brains lighting up. But if you actually look at what people say they hallucinate, particularly people who are in distressed states, what they say kind of makes a lot of sense, almost always, in terms of themselves and their own beliefs and their own fears and their own life experiences. So these are not just weird little things that pop up, these are things that seem to have a psychological and personal significance to people. Now I could talk about hallucinations all day, yeah, I wish I could, but I can't, because I kind of move on now. But what I want you to get out of that is hallucinations are typical things that happen. Some people appear to lose insight into the nature of these hallucinations. We talk about those people experiencing psychosis. But even for those people, there's a significance behind their hallucinations which should never kind of be denied. And that becomes even kind of clearer when we start thinking about delusions, which is the next thing I want to move on to, the three hallucinations, delusions, sort. Now we're on delusions. Delusions are really complex and really challenging philosophically to think about, and that's why I think they're interesting. Let's just start with what they are, how they're defined. So, we're on delusions 1. The definition of a delusion. And as we're going to see in a minute, defining a delusion is actually almost impossible, what actually one is, because, well, for all sorts of reasons. But if you open something like DSM, you know, the book of mental disorders, there's a definition of delusion in there, and it's something like a firmly held false belief, so, you know, believing something that isn't true, that is not ordinarily accepted by members of the person's culture or subculture. So what we're saying is people who believe things that other people around them don't believe. Well, that's immediately problematic, isn't it? Because I think lots of people might believe things that people around them don't believe. So again, at what point does this therefore become a delusion? Well, we'll talk about fine details and how that might be defined in a minute, but I'll move on first to talk about these three particular forms of false belief that in the psychiatric literature, and actually in practice, you know, realistically in practice this is the case, we find these three particular kinds of false belief. Absolutely loads, much more than anything else. Because I mean, a false belief could be anything. I could believe that this blackboard is actually white, that would be a false belief. I could kind of argue it with you. But actually, if we're talking about people with psychosis, you don't find usually those kinds of false beliefs. You find these particular sorts here, delusions of grandeur, delusions of reference, or paranoid delusions. And certainly in the West, in our culture, these are things that seem to pop up time and time again. Really interesting. Let me tell you a bit more. Delusions of grandeur. What are they? Well, they are basically beliefs that one is somehow superior to those around them. Now, of course, maybe one of us. We're quite superior to those around us. But we're talking about really superior. Potentially supernaturally superior. Maybe beliefs about being kind of chosen. Beliefs about having qualities or abilities that those around you don't have, beliefs about having kind of magical powers, beliefs about being messianic, so, you know, believing you are chosen by God. These are very common forms of delusion that seem to emerge. Now the thing is, we need to just put this in context. As I said, one could believe anything that's false. I could believe this blackboard is white, and I can argue it with you. But those are the things you get things like this. So why might it be then that so many people develop these false beliefs about themselves being kind of almighty and powerful and omnipotent and better than those around them? Well, we'll come on to it in a minute. I think there's a very clear reason actually why the kinds of people who end up with particularly chronic psychosis, so the recurrent stuff that comes time and time again, there's very specific reasons why some of those people might end up believing quite grandiose things. I'll come to that in a minute. I think it all has a meaning. You've got to think what is the meaning of it. Next one, delusions of reference. Delusions of reference are beliefs that one is somehow being communicated to or contacted through media which are kind of not clearly about you as an individual. So, for example, being able to watch the news and think that the newsreader is talking to you in code, and using code to kind of give you instructions or to tell you about how different you are from everyone else around you. That's one example. Another example might be kind of in a newspaper or looking at websites and thinking that, like, I don't know, the titles of web pages, articles in newspapers are again a code that is communicating something to you. This idea you are being referenced specifically. in some ways not that different from grandiose delusions, in that it's about you as an individual being picked out in a way that's kind of very special and just for you, whereas everything else, everyone else wouldn't be able to access these same things in the same way. So again, we'll come on to, well, why might it be that so many people, particularly with these chronic and recurrent issues like this, might come to these sort of beliefs? And the final one is paranoid delusions. So paranoid delusions are the belief that you are somehow being persecuted, followed, conspired against. And these can be from the level of that you are being followed by people, to kind of much more subjectively idiosyncratic things, like, for instance, believing that there's a government conspiracy against you, believing that cameras might have been hidden around your house or in your telly. Last week I talked about that girl with kind of personality issues who had this really big psychotic episode when she was about 17. Her psychotic episode actually was just after she'd been put into this house all by kind of herself, which was very isolated, and she had this awful experience. But basically it ended up with her removing all the wiring from her house. She pulled, such a dangerous thing to do, she pulled all the skirting boards off around the house and pulled out all the wiring, because her belief was that within that wiring there were things that would kind of be conducting her thoughts and relaying them back to, I don't know, somebody. I'm not sure if it was the police or the government. Some kind of agent was suspected in that, and obviously, there was no truth whatsoever to these beliefs, but for her she believed them very passionately. So that is an example of a paranoid delusion. Paranoid delusions are very interesting. One of the reasons is that the fact that they do kind of go across this spectrum from just being followed at this end to pulling out all the wiring in your house at the other end. Because I think, as we'll come on to in a bit, that notion of, I'm being followed, people are conspiring against me, there might actually be a lot of truth to that for many people with psychosis. What I'm saying is actually some people with psychosis may be reasonably paranoid about some things that are going on around them, not in terms of wiring conducting their thoughts, but in terms of people kind of not conspiring against them, but making decisions about them and then being excluded from those decisions and all the rest. So it's an interesting issue actually, that particularly if you're detained under the Mental Health Act, you might have a lot of reasons to be paranoid, and I don't think it necessarily helps people who are a bit paranoid anyway. But we'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. What I'd actually like to do now is just give you a little break for a minute to think about how difficult it is to define a delusion. Now I know I've given you these three things, delusions of grandeur, delusions of reference and paranoid delusions, and I've given you these very striking examples of those that are their most unusual. But there is this big issue here about, well, when does a belief become a false belief? Like, how does one define if someone is believing something and is deluded in believing it, rather than just thinking something a bit unusual? I'm just going to give you 30 seconds as a break, but also think about it. And in that 30 seconds, you don't have to discuss it with people around you if you don't feel comfortable. You can just do it by yourselves. I want you to identify one thing that you believe yourself that you think is unusual, that people around you may not believe. You don't have to write it down. I just want you to think about it, because everyone has some things that they believe that are a bit unusual. And it might be an opinion, it might be an attitude, it might be something you actually believe. I bet there's some people in this room who believe in ghosts, for a start off, yeah? Probably quite a few, or believe in spiritualist mediums. I don't believe in any of that stuff, so straight away we have a difference. So just have a think, 30 seconds. You're not going to have to share it back, but I want to explore when it is a belief might become false or unusual. I'll now tell you some of mine, and we can talk about those. Okay, so 30-second break. Go. Any of us with our kind of unusual beliefs that we all have of being humans, I think usually we know when to share those or not to share those. Or perhaps it's even more subtle. Perhaps we know that when we share them, we might need to do it in a kind of particular way to show that we understand that they might be kind of unusual beliefs. So, really nice paper, that Palmer reference. It's a very social sciencey paper, so it may not be to everyone's taste. But just looking at how people talk about delusions and comparing what feels like deluded talk against people just talking about seeing ghosts and stuff. Because I mean, this stuff could be assumed to be deluded, but lots of people talk about seeing ghosts, and those aren't people with psychosis. And that Palmer paper identifies differences in how those stories are told, actually. For instance, usually when people tell stories about ghosts or seeing aliens or anything that might be a bit unusual, they do it in this really particular way. They give loads of details before they hit the punchline. So they're like, I was just in the kitchen, I was just doing a bit of ironing, and the clock just struck 10 o'clock, and then suddenly Uncle Colin popped up, he'd been dead for 10 years or something. Yeah, it's got all this preamble. And also, another thing people do is they tend to say things like, well, at first I thought it was just next door's cat running across, and then I looked and it's actually a ghost. I mean, they never say it like that explicitly, but that's kind of the way that people organise those stories. Whereas what is shown in that Palmer paper is people who identified as psychosis, they're psychotic, don't necessarily say different things, but they kind of miss out on those preambles. So it's much more like, well, I was walking through the park and you never guess what, I saw Thor, the Norse god of thunder, jogging. And the psychiatrist was like, well, really? Is that, did you really? Are you sure it wasn't just somebody with a stripe on them? No, yeah, definitely. Thor, Norse god of thunder. And I mean, that's actually in the stuff that's analysed, and it's really interesting that kind of qualitatively, that isn't, is that any more unusual than saying you're seeing a ghost? I mean, I don't know. But what is different is the way it's presented. So perhaps what we're getting at is delusions are less about beliefs and maybe more about the presentation of those beliefs. As I say, there are some pretty wild ideas out there in the world that people believe. Spend 5 minutes on the internet and you will find all sorts of people who believe all sorts of things, but we would not call those people. We would not describe those people in terms of psychosis when there's this loss of insight, as we kind of know that. And the final point I want to make about delusions is, as with hallucinations, rarely do you meet someone with a delusion where you can't pinpoint that delusion as some kind of truth or fact for that person at some point, even if it's kind of blown out of all proportion now. These things have what's called a kernel of truth usually. So grandiose delusions, you can usually track those back. The sad thing about grandiose delusions, about believing yourself as messianic or omnipotent or all-powerful, is you tend to find those very much in people with very bad histories of trauma and abuse, people with what are actually incredibly low self-esteem behind the kind of scenes. And for those people, you can usually trace those delusions back to something that someone significant once said to them, maybe a nice thing, one nice thing that was said to people in what are often very horrendously damaged and upsetting lives. These people might kind of develop this omnipotence as a kind of a defence, and I do think that's a good way to understand this. Being grandiose is a kind of way of defending yourself, if actually underneath you are kind of this very small, scared little thing. You can adopt this persona. I'm not saying people don't believe those personas, because I think they do. It's really complex. Human psychology is so complex. But I think it has a meaning and a function for those people. And then the other thing I'd say, again, is about paranoid delusions, and let's just hold on to that for a minute. The thing I said about, I have to go to a piece of chalk, because I need to write working down. The thing I said about maybe like paranoid delusions, again, might have a very rational meaning if you think about it in terms of someone being treated. There's a word, which I'm going to write with my poor script, iatrogenic. Okay, that is an interesting word. Now, what iatrogenic means, and it applies across all of medicine. Iatrogenic is harm that is caused by the treatment itself. So if you have a treatment has an iatrogenic effect, what we're actually saying is the treatment kind of makes someone worse. And, you know, lots of drugs have side effects, so we talk about those potentially having iatrogenic harm on the person taking them. This is discussed a lot in mental health as well, the idea that in some way you treat people with mental health difficulties actually make them worse. Well, I think, yes, there's an awful lot of argument there. Thinking of paranoid delusions, now if you are having what is a frightening sensory experience where you're experiencing hallucinations and the world is kind of loosening and how it fits together around you, and then you are, by law, placed in a hospital against your will and have various treatments given to you, and you know, these treatments can involve actually kind of like forcibly giving people medication, so you know, being forced to be injected with psychoactive drugs. I mean, can we just like hold on for a moment about how traumatic that experience would be? It would be horrendous things happen to you. Is it any surprise that people who have those experiences may become paranoid? I think it's actually perfectly reasonable often if you are in that environment and you've got all these people that you don't know talking about you and making decisions about you. Let's be honest, if you were a bit paranoid to start with, it's going to pretty much take it quite a long way for you. So I don't think we can rule out sometimes paranoid delusions having an iatrogenic relationship with the treatments that are given to people who experience psychosis. Now, not always. There's plenty of people out there with all kinds of wild paranoid beliefs who've never been even near a mental health system. So I'm talking about those people who end up detained under the Mental Health Act. But it's an important thing to think about. And again, you know, is this kind of quite a rational response to something that is being treated in a way that is pretty traumatic and kind of irrational in the way it's enacted? Last bit now, let's talk about thought disorder. We're not going to be able to do the exercise that I planned for this whole video and the screen and all that. So let's just talk about what thought disorder is quickly. What thought disorder actually is really unusual communication, which is then interpreted. People see, like, I don't know, psychiatrists will see this unusual communication and say, well, okay, if you're communicating like that, your thoughts must be disordered by the scenes, behind the scenes. So thought disorder is all about language, actually. But it's an assumption that that language is telling you something about the person's mind. And remember, not all people with psychosis have thought disorder, just like not all people have hallucinations or illusions. This is something that some people experience. And there's a huge list of things that are part of thought disorder. But really, the story about thought disorder is kind of incoherence. People losing the ability to coherently put discourse together. So the people who were okay, and then they came into this episode, and then it kind of loosened up in their talk and communication, and things became quite incoherent. So here's some of the examples on here of those kind of phenomena. Loose associations is kind of, well, as it sounds really, where things that normally, kind of associations we normally take for granted between objects in the world. You think about semantic relationships, you want to think that way, you know, we kind of all know that like cars and buses are sort of similar because they're both vehicles, you know, all that sort of stuff. All that stuff, sometimes with people who are having issues, seems to loosen up. So normal links between ideas and words, we'll assume, seem to become much looser and more fluid. And we assume that because the way people begin to talk when they're thought disordered kind of belies that there's a lack of that. The normal meanings that fit together appear to begin to dissolve. And that leads to something called loss of goal, which is kind of, sometimes it's called knight smooth thinking. You know, knight in chess, it goes up and along a bit. And I guess someone thought, well, that's a strange way for a piece to move. So let's call this kind of talk knight smooth thinking. Because what happens in knight smooth thinking or loss of goal is that rather than kind of pursuing an argument straight forward, so everything you say leads on from the thing before it and you kind of make your argument that way, it seems to come a bit tangential and off. So people try and make an argument about something, it seems to then slip off onto something else. And you can perhaps look retrospectively and say, well, I can kind of see actually where that person was then going, but it had this big funny sideways move in what they were talking about, and it just wasn't expected, and at the time it got really incoherent. So loss of goal is about when people try and produce narrative and it doesn't really hold on to a thread in the way you might expect. And then there's other stuff like unusual, distorted, nonsense words. I think it starts sounding a bit like some kind of aphasia here, or even autism, and people try to make those links, but not necessarily very well. We're just talking about on the surface, this is what it looks like. And then things like repetition and perseveration, so repeating bits of language, or what perseveration is, literally, is that you kind of have the same response regardless of what stimuli you're given. So in language, perseveration is, you know, you ask a question and you get one response, and you ask another question, and it gets exactly the same response, and then another question, and it gets exactly the same response again. The person just responds regardless of kind of what you're doing. Whatever input you give them leads to them producing the same response. So again, it's something you find a lot in things like autism, brain injury. Yeah, these are kind of common things you've probably come across. I've given you a bit of language that we're going to do some analysis on, but we can't because we haven't got the screen. So I'll just sort of kind of read it out to you. So this is genuine. So this is someone talking to a psychiatrist. So, for instance, you get pain. For instance, heavy exercise. For instance, there's black. You get, for instance, with suffering from black depression. In fact, for 7 years. You're not take somewhere over earning a big pause, and headaches are internal. Nurses, I think, come from, in fact, you can't leave out a set of nurses. In fact, make sure you operate on the scalp, for instance, is impossible to, blah, 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 blah. Now, what I'm kind of using this to show you, I think we can pick up that this appears quite incoherent. There's also repetition, so there's for instance and in fact. I mean, you can count them, they're appearing all over the place, these little chunks, so that would be an example of some repetition. There's also this kind of incoherence, there's loss of goal. So I'd say at that very beginning bit where the person says, for instance, heavy exercise, for instance, then they go on to just black, with suffering from black depression. I mean, that feels like a loss of goal to me. And actually, you know, quite often people talk about things like exercise and depression together, because apparently, well, I believe for a while that doing exercise if you're depressed is a good thing. So, I mean, perhaps we could read back and think, well, maybe there are some sort of links in there between heavy exercise and black depression, but it's kind of not obvious from this. This person slipped off track. And then there's also bits of unusual language. So look at the second paragraph you get. You can't leave out a set of nurses. Set of nurses? Does that, I suppose you could have a set of nurses. That's not what people usually say, is it? So again, it's quite mixed up and unusual language. So what I'd suggest you do after today is just go through this and kind of compare it against those features of thought disorder that I gave you on the last slide. And also I've asked you to look for some other ones, because there's quite a lot written about this sort of stuff. And see what you think you can identify. It's not kind of a right or wrong question. It's more about interpretation. But I think you can kind of see all that stuff there. So lots been said about thought disorder. People try to compare it to aphasia, dementia, head injury, autism. We've not really got anywhere. And there's some structural similarities. But what I want to get across is that people who experience this aren't necessarily like this all the time. They might have long periods of lucidity, and then periods of this as well. And certainly for people who have a transient psychotic episode, they may be like this just once in their life, so that's interesting. That immediately takes it somewhere different to something like aphasia or autism. Now, that's actually, unfortunately, it. I had so many lovely learning activities to give. They've all been ruined. What I want you to kind of get out of today is this thing: hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder. These are the clinical defining parts of psychosis combined with a lack of insight. You don't have to have all of those, but you just have to have some of them. All three of them are kind of like complex sets of experiences and behaviours which probably are very meaningful for the person experiencing them, but from the outside appear quite unusual. Certainly things like hallucinations and delusions. You will have experienced similar things in your own life. So it's important to reflect on that kind of stuff when you think about these issues. Thought disorder is maybe a bit more complex. Something you might want to read around a bit more, because there's lots of different ideas about why people might do that. And again, there are some explanations that are quite functional. Like, well, how might it benefit someone in some ways to behave, think, talk like this at particular points? The exam will be on nothing more than those three parts, and also kind of it's important, I think, to bring up that we've got this issue that psychosis can be transient or recurring. Other than that, this is then the beginning for any of you who want to go further and read about this, because this is not something you can do justice in an hour. I mean, I know it's not central to any of your courses necessarily, but there's an awful lot of interesting stuff written from different perspectives. And if you do want to read further, just do what I said at the start. Try and triangulate this kind of clinical stuff with people's actual experiences, and also with the kind of institutions and laws that exist to protect and treat people who have these kind of issues. It's only when you put all of them together that it makes some kind of sense. Now we've got some time for some questions. I'm sorry it was a bit of a mess doing it, that slide's awful. But can questions, thoughts, points of discussion, I can just go and crawl up into the somewhere and die there. Okay, so it doesn't need to be anything, but fine. I think what I'll do is I'll make my full slides available online, because there were, you can see the activities that I have to do. And I will try, I use like clips out of this BBC documentary, which I hope is like available on iPlayer actually. So I'll try and find out if that documentary is available, and I'll give you the link, so at least you can look at the stuff I've shown you. Thank you very much for your patience, and if anything feels unclear after today, when you go through your notes, just email me, and I'll sort it out. Thank you.